The Senate Judiciary Committee held a hearing on the street gang MS-13, which began in Los Angeles and has spread across the U.S. and Central America. Federal law enforcement officials testified about efforts to counter the threat and deport MS-13 members. Senator Chuck Grassley chairs the 2-hour hearing.
Good morning, everybody. Normally, we don't start until the ranking member's here, but people have scheduling problems today, and I've consulted with the staff, and I can go ahead without waiting. Thank you, Senator Cornyn, for being here. Senator Kennedy's coming. The topic of today's hearing involves the MS-13 crisis that's growing and spreading in communities across the nation. The atrocities of these criminals are not new. The group has existed since the 1980s and has made a reputation for itself as a perpetrator of extreme and often gruesome violence. This organization has been dubbed the world's most dangerous gang, and some say it would be a terrorist organization. But you wouldn't expect anything less from a group whose model happens to be kill, rape, and control. Unfortunately, over the past 2 years, this terrifying model has become a vicious reality for many communities across our country. So far this year, the gang has been publicly linked to dozens of high-profile killings, rapes, and assaults across the country, from Washington, D.C., metro area, to Houston, Texas, and I name a lot of other communities as well. Undoubtedly, there are many, many more that simply haven't been reported. Let me give the committee just a few examples of this group's absolute brutality and inhumanity. MS-13 has been responsible for nearly 20 murders on Long Island just since 2010, with victims including high school-aged children as young as 16. The group is also considered responsible for an additional 32 violent acts, including 8 attempted murders. In January, 2 gang members, both of whom are unauthorized immigrants, lured a 22-year-old man from New Jersey to Maryland with the promise of sex, where he butchered that person and left him in the woods near Gaithersburg, Maryland, to rot. In March, 2 MS-13 members were charged with kidnapping and sexually assaulting 3 teenage girls for several weeks and eventually murdering one of them in what has been described as a satanic ritual. In March and April, a string of MS-13 murders occurred across Southern Virginia, with perhaps the most graphic being the murder of 17-year-old Raymond Wood. According to reports, Wood's body was found face down in the road, and the MS-13 suspects had cut his hands and throat before stabbing him 16 times. Now, while these examples are horrifying, they're far from isolated. According to the Department of Justice, MS-13 regularly conducts gang activities in at least 40 states, the District of Columbia, and their violence touches nearly every major community in America. What's even more troubling than the recent surge of MS-13 gang violence is the fact the organization has a new and more disturbing recruitment strategy. It's this: targeting unaccompanied aliens, children. Let me tell you a story of one such child who was targeted by MS-13 and ultimately lost his life to their violence. As the Washington Post reported last Friday afternoon, Danny Centineo Miranda was just 16 years old when he was apprehended at the border. He traveled to the United States without his parents, and like other minors, he was sent by the federal government to live with a sponsor, in this case an uncle, in an American community. Danny was enrolled in the local school where he was, according to reports, sucked into tensions between MS-13 and rival gangs. This tension eventually led MS-13 gang leaders in El Salvador to order Danny's assassination, and he was shot to death at the school bus stop one morning. Danny's tragic story is all too common example of MS-13's ruthless targeting of children. It is well known that MS-13 actively targets and recruits children as young as 8 years old. Unaccompanied minors are particularly prime candidates for gang recruitment. Their illegal status and Central American heritage alone make them vulnerable targets for MS-13 recruitment. While their illegal status and Central American heritage are key factors in MS-13's targeting, without a doubt, the failure of the current system for handling these children is also to blame. The current system is fraught with abuse, with systematic errors, and lack of effective cooperation. Today, we will hear from agencies who share responsibility for allowing these children to fall through the cracks and become target for MS-13 recruitment. To help us get to the bottom of the crisis, we've asked representatives at the table, the Justice Department, Health and Human Services, and the Department of Homeland Security to appear today and to give us their point of view and answer our questions. Independent reports have found that the Customs and Border Patrol has allowed many MS-13 gang members to enter the United States. According to the whistleblower documents obtained by Chairman Johnson, the Obama administration knowingly released at least 16 known MS-13 members into communities after their apprehension. Many of these members were unaccompanied children. Once an unaccompanied children are apprehended, the Office of Refugee Settlement is supposed to find these children an appropriate sponsor. Often these sponsors themselves are in the country illegally, and many of them have criminal backgrounds. Because of the lack of post-release oversight, many children have been placed in dangerous situations, including illegal working environments and in some cases even prostitution rings. This precarious combination of events, trafficking to and apprehension at the United States border and placement with inappropriate sponsors makes unaccompanied children vulnerable to gang recruitment. With promises of a cultural community and an escape from often harrowing and isolating living conditions at home, MS-13 has become an alternative option for too many young people. In spite of ample evidence that unaccompanied children are a prime target for MS-13 recruitments, none of the government agencies here today have any statistics about how many of the more than 10,000 gang members in the United States entered and were recruited as unaccompanied children. The end result of the government's total failure to establish an efficient process and meaningful oversight of the placement of these children has led to the current MS-13 crisis. Today's hearing is a first step in plotting a path forward. Throughout the course of this hearing, we're going to explore how Customs and Border Patrol and the Office of Refugee Resettlement can better cooperate to ensure the safe and proper placement of unaccompanied children and to decimate MS-13's recruitment incentive. We're also going to hear what steps Immigration, Customs and Enforcement and the Department of Justice are taking to eliminate this organization on the back end. At the end of this hearing, I fully expect the government witnesses to have given this committee a better understanding of what needs to be and must be done to end this threat. Too many innocent Americans and immigrant lives are at stake. Thank you, Senator Franken. It's now your say whatever you want to say.
Well, before I begin, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing and for focusing attention on an issue that has significant implications for public safety. Gang violence, particularly violence perpetrated by MS-13 and its rival, the 18th Street Gang, threatens the safety and security of our communities, most especially our immigrant communities. After police in Los Angeles arrested close to 24 MS-13 gang members last month, LAPD Chief Charlie Beck explained that gangs like MS-13 prey on immigrants, in particular on undocumented immigrants. He said, quote, "They extort them, they rob them, they rape them, they murder them." But Chief Beck also made clear that, quote, "Without immigrants' cooperation as witnesses, none of these arrests would be possible." Now, Chief Beck knows, and I expect that MS-13 knows as well, that members of our immigrant communities are far less likely to seek help from law enforcement if they know that the police officer who responds to that call is going to check their papers. So I think it's quite clear that fighting MS-13 doesn't just demand a coordinated effort on the part of state and local law enforcement. Fighting MS-13 requires that law enforcement officials have the trust and respect of the communities targeted. I hope that today's witnesses are able to speak to how we are working to maintain that trust and respect, notwithstanding the anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies that we've seen emerge from the Trump campaign and sadly, the Trump administration. I also think it's important to acknowledge that some members of our immigrant communities came to this country to escape the violence and conflict that MS-13 and other gangs inflicted upon them in their home countries. Sadly, for Central American immigrants, particularly those from the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, the violence, extortion, and forced recruitment that our MS-13 stock and trade are all too familiar. Recent studies have demonstrated that fear of gang violence, particularly sexual and gender-based violence targeting children, is a significant factor in some families' decisions to leave their home country in search of safety and security here in America. So I hope today's witnesses are able to help us understand how MS-13's activities in Central America force children and families to make the long journey here. I also hope today's witnesses can help us understand how addressing the root causes of this violence in Central America fits into the federal government's efforts to fight MS-13 here at home. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, I appreciate your holding this hearing.
Thank you. For the benefit of the committee as well as witnesses, I'm going to have one of my colleagues chair from 11 to 11:25 so I can go and ask some questions on trade at the Finance Committee down the hall. I should be back. We all have to remember that the well, no, I guess we'll be done by the time the 2-hour rule goes into effect. I'm going to introduce the panel, and then I'll ask you to I'd like to swear you after that, and then I'll take your testimony. Carla Provost, Acting Chief of the U.S. Border Patrol. Ms. Provost has a long and distinguished career in law enforcement. She began with the Riley County Police Department, Manhattan, Kansas, joined the Border Patrol in 1997. She has held numerous leadership positions, including Supervisory Border Patrol Agent. In 1997, Border Patrol Agent in Charge in 2009, Deputy Chief Patrol Agent 2011, Chief Patrol Agent in 2013, and Deputy Assistant Commissioner of the Office of Professional Responsibility 2015. Scott Lloyd is Director of the Office of Refugee Settlement. Mr. Lloyd earned his JD from Catholic University. Prior, Mr. Lloyd served as Chief Counsel, Public Policy Office, Knights of Columbus, where he helped shape the organization's humanitarian response and led its policy advocacy of ethnic and religious minority victims of ISIS. Mr. Lloyd has served in public sphere on Government Reform Subcommittee of Criminal Justice, Drug Policy, and Human Resources, and at the Department of Health and Human Services. Derek Benner is the Acting Executive Associate Director for Homeland Security Investigation. Mr. Benner began his career in law enforcement in the U.S. Customs Service, where he served as Customs Inspector, a Marine Enforcement Officer, a Special Agent, and a manager of the Maritime Smuggling Task Force. Prior to his current position, Mr. Benner served as Special Agent for Homeland Security Investigations, where he led multi-agency task forces in targeting cross-border criminal activity in the California-Mexican border area. Mr. Albence is Executive Associate Director of Enforcement and Removal Operations. In this role, he leads ERO in its mission to identify and remove individuals who present a danger to national security or public safety. He has over 23 years of federal law enforcement experience and has held numerous leadership positions, such as Deputy Assistant Director for Investigations, Associate Special Agent in Charge, and Deputy Special Agent in Charge with the former U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service. Mr. Albence has also served as Unit Chief for ICE Office of Investigation Training Academy. Kenneth Blanco is the Assistant Attorney General for Criminal Division. Mr. Blanco has earned a JD at Georgetown Law Center, where he currently teaches as an adjunct professor. Mr. Blanco began his career in the Miami-Dade State's Attorney Office. He joined the Southern District of Florida U.S. Attorney's Office in '98. Mr. Blanco has held numerous leadership positions, including Deputy Chief of Narcotics, Chief of High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area, Acting Chief of Narcotics, and Deputy Chief of Major Crimes Section. In 2008, Mr. Blanco served as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General. Would you please stand? Do you affirm that the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Each has affirmed. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a quick housekeeping question?
Yeah.
You alluded to the 2-hour rule.
Yeah, but I think we're starting at noon, aren't we?
But is there an objection to committee's meeting during today's session of the Senate?
Only rumors.
Okay.
Only rumors. But sometimes.
And that's associated with the protest of some of our colleagues over the health care issue?
Yes.
Thank you.
As far as I know, it was yesterday at least.
Mr. Chair, if I may just, on that, for those in the audience who wouldn't know what that is, it is some thinking that something as important as this should not go as long as it needs to and arbitrarily cutting it off at noon today. This is a critically important meeting that if every member were here right now, we couldn't finish by noon. So for somebody at the end of the dais, I hope they don't show up so that I do have an opportunity to ask my questions. This is a critically important subject. We should not be cutting off debate and discussion for arbitrary reasons related to things that have nothing to do with this pressing problem.
Yeah. Senator, tell us under the early bird rule you're protected. Okay. Ms. Provost, by the way, each of you will have probably a longer statement than the 5 minutes you've been allocated. That longer statement will be automatically put in the record. I don't cut people off right at the 5 minutes, but when the red light goes on, I'd appreciate it if you would try to summarize as quickly as you could. Proceed, Ms. Propos.
Thank you. Chairman Grassley, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today to discuss the role of U.S. Customs and Border Protection in protecting the homeland and securing our nation's borders. Thanks to the support and leadership of the President, Congress, our Secretary, and Acting Commissioner, as well as the hard work of the men and women of CBP, we are making significant progress towards securing our borders against the threats posed by transnational criminal organizations such as Mara Salvatrucha, more commonly known as MS-13. Since taking office, the President has issued executive orders intended to secure our borders and enforce immigration laws, especially as they relate to TCOs. Implementation of policies issued by the Secretary and the significant investments we have made in border enforcement personnel, technology, and infrastructure have led to historic decline in illegal crossings along the southwest border. One of the greatest challenges we continue to face along the southwest border, however, are TCOs, such as the International Criminal Organization, MS-13. When the U.S. Border Patrol encounters known gang members or aliens who admit to gang affiliation, biographic information is collected and recorded in the Border Patrol electronic system of record. Biometric information is collected for all aliens over the age of 14. The electronic system collects fingerprint information and runs record checks on detainees, helping identify criminals and ensure they are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Among those we encounter unaccompanied alien children with suspected TCO affiliations, such as MS-13, present unique challenges. All UACs are processed in accordance with applicable laws, regulations, court orders, and policies. Pursuant to the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008, once a child is determined to meet the definition of a UAC, CBP is required to transfer the UAC into the care and custody of Health and Human Services within 72 hours, except in unusual circumstances. If a UAC is suspected of being a member of or affiliated with a gang, the information is recorded and conveyed to an ICE Field Office Juvenile Coordinator and HHS Office of Refugee and Resettlement when a placement request is generated. Secure placement is requested for any UAC who has a known gang affiliation. We also screen UACs for human trafficking indicators, including trafficking by gangs such as MS-13. Of the more than 250,000 UACs apprehended since 2012, approximately 160 are suspected of having gang affiliations, including affiliations with MS-13. The Department's Unity of Effort initiative, including the Joint Task Forces, has strengthened management processes to enable DHS component operations to address TCOs. The JTFs are currently executing more than 40 integrated operations against TCOs and illicit networks by arresting convicted felons, sex offenders, and seizing weapons and narcotics. With the support of Congress, CBP will continue to work with our law enforcement partners, leverage their capabilities, and continue to target individuals and organizations, including MS-13, whose criminal conduct undermines communities, the integrity of the immigration system, and overall border security. We will take all appropriate steps to implement the provisions of the President's executive orders, which support the Department's efforts to disrupt and dismantle TCOs that are fortifying their illicit networks in the border region and beyond. Distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important issue. In closing, I would like to take a moment to mention that although illegal immigration is trending downward, assaults against Border Patrol agents are on the rise. In fact, Border Patrol agents are among the most assaulted federal law enforcement personnel in the country. As of June 1st of this year, Border Patrol agents were assaulted more than 550 times compared to fewer than 300 times during the same reporting period last year. Despite the challenges of the job, the men and women of CBP work tirelessly to protect our borders and the American people. I sincerely thank the men and women of the United States Border Patrol for their hard work and dedication to duty every day to selflessly ensure our nation's security. I am proud to serve alongside them with honor first. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Dangerous job that your colleagues have there. You have done that and served them well. Mr. Scott, or Mr. Lloyd.
Chairman Grassley, distinguished members of the committee, it's my honor to appear before this committee on behalf of the Department of Health and Human Services. I'm Scott Lloyd, the Director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement within the Administration for Children and Families. As the ORR Director, I coordinate the refugee resettlement efforts for HHS, and I also oversee the Unaccompanied Alien Children Program. Since joining ORR in late March, one of my top priorities has been to learn the complexities of the UAC program and the challenges it faces. I want ORR and our partners to do everything we can to provide for the safety and well-being of the children in our care. I also want to bring our partners together to tackle the safety concerns for children and their communities after the release from ORR custody. This year, we have begun work in the area of community safety, which is one of the administration's top priorities. I already had an eye on this issue when, within my first month at ORR, I was confronted with news reports of alleged violence amongst former UAC, which served to confirm what we know already. While Homeland Security and juvenile justice are not ORR's areas of expertise, we cannot fulfill our mission with an approach that is neglectful of either. This prompted the creation of the ORR Community Safety Initiative. The goal of this initiative is to equip UAC with the tools they need to stay safe from gangs like MS-13 and violence, and to ensure that the UAC we release from our care do not pose a danger to our communities. We have expanded our interagency work with the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice. Our interagency partners have the expertise to share best practices and help us improve our current efforts. For example, DOJ is providing guidance to us on gang prevention programs for UAC and trainings for our staff and our grantees. Local DHS staff are training ORR post-release services providers on how to identify MS-13 and other gang colors and signs, and whom to notify if they become aware of MS-13 and other gang activity. We are working to enhance our day-to-day consultations with DHS. 24 hours before we release a UAC from custody, we notify DHS of the sponsor's identity, location, and relationship to the UAC. And we ask for DHS input regarding the safety of the release for the UAC and for their community. We notify DHS again 24 hours after the minor's release. We are also reviewing the ways we communicate with DHS to strengthen ORR's decision-making on releases of UAC at higher risk of violence or criminal activity. When we release UAC from our care, we now alert sponsors to the potential danger of gang recruitment activity so they are prepared to help the UAC avoid it. The Community Safety Initiative will continue to be a top priority for us. In the coming year, we hope to refine our screening tools to identify criminal involvement or intent, to further develop our partnerships with juvenile justice and law enforcement entities, and to put into place gang prevention and educational programs in our facilities. In addition to our activities under the Community Safety Initiative, we are assessing our policies and procedures through the lens of the safety of the American communities and individual UAC. Our revised policies include clarification on which youth need placement in one of our secure facilities as opposed to one of our staff secure or medium secure security facilities. The policies now address the situation of UAC who self-report MS-13 or other gang involvement. In addition, senior ORR leadership now reviews all releases from secure and staff secure facilities, and I make the final release decision. Another important step in the safety of releases is to improve the assessment of sponsors. Prior to my arrival in ORR, the agency had made a number of improvements in this area. For example, the decrease of the ability of sponsors to use fraudulent documents. ORR limited the types of documents ORR accepts as evidence of identity for the sponsor, the household members, or any adults listed in a sponsor care plan. The guidance also clarified how we determine the sponsor's address, the child's identity, and the sponsor-child relationship. These changes help to protect the children from traffickers, smugglers, and others who may wish to do them harm. If ORR discovers that a sponsor is using fraudulent documents, we report it to the HHS Office of the Inspector General and to U.S. Customs Enforcement's Office of Homeland Security Investigations. In the area of home studies, ORR has increased discretionary home studies and post-release services. We now require home studies for all UAC 12 years of age and younger being released to non-relative sponsors. Another step in improving the safety of releases is to contact the child and the sponsor shortly after release, which is a critical adjustment period. To accomplish this, ORR initiated safety and well-being calls 30 days after release. If the case manager has a concern about the child's safety or well-being, they must report all concerns to appropriate investigative agencies. To remove children from unsafe situations, ORR reports notifications of concern to local law enforcement for follow-up. In closing, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to update you on ORR's recent efforts and for your commitment to the safety and well-being of unaccompanied alien children and the communities where they reside. I look forward to working with you on our community safety initiative, our continuing improvement of policies and procedures in all facets of the UAC program. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Benner.
Chairman Grassley and distinguished members, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the efforts of the frontline men and women of Homeland Security investigations in their efforts to investigate, disrupt, and dismantle violent gang activity in the United States. My oral statement will focus on HSI's efforts in combating transnational gang violence, specifically MS-13 gangs in the United States and abroad. As we know, MS-13 is a transnational criminal organization that includes members in the United States and El Salvador, where gang leadership directs and controls cells, often referred to as cliques, here in the United States from command and control centers in El Salvador. MS-13 perpetuates numerous violations within HSI's purview, and through our investigations, we have researched and investigated MS-13's sophisticated communication and financial networks, and determined that its primary source of income is generated through extortion and prostitution. They also generate money through drugs, weapons, and human trafficking. In response to the gang epidemic, HSI initiated Operation Community Shield, which combines our expansive statutory, criminal, and civil enforcement authorities in partnership with state and local and foreign law enforcement agencies to combat the growth of gangs throughout the United States. Through this platform, HSI executes its anti-gang initiatives to include the specialized urban response gang enforcement operations. Since its inception, HSI and its partner agencies have made over 57,000 criminal and administrative arrests of gang members, leaders, and associates, including more than 7,000 MS-13 gang leaders, members, and associates. At the same time that HSI pursues domestic criminal investigations, we are also pushing out the border by capitalizing on our international partnerships with foreign law enforcement officials, and we accomplish this through the use of our transnational criminal investigative units and Operation Citadel to work with host country law enforcement to identify potential bad actors along the illicit pathways, and at the same time exploiting information with the goal of identifying unknown gang cliques operating here in the United States. HSI's most recent surge operation, Project New Dawn, which is the largest gang operation in the history of this agency, resulted in 1,378 arrests. Of those, almost 1,100 were gang members or gang associates, 903 were charged with criminal offenses, and 192 were arrested administratively for immigration violations. The majority of the arrestees were affiliated with MS-13, the Bloods, and the Crips. Enforcement actions occurred around the country, with the greatest activity taking place in Houston, Newark, Atlanta, and the New York area. This surge operation could not have been as successful without the cooperation and participation of our federal, state, and local law enforcement partners and the Department of Justice. As directed by the President's executive order, HSI will continue to give a high priority and devote additional resources to disrupting and dismantling the TCOs and their subsidiary organizations. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today and for your continued support of the men and women on the front lines in HSI in executing their law enforcement mission, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Benner. Now, Mr. Albence.
Good morning, Chairman Grassley and distinguished members of the committee. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the responsibility of the Office of Enforcement and Removal Operations within U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement in combating gang activity and its role in addressing issues related to unaccompanied alien children. The 6,000 dedicated ERO officers enforce our nation's immigration laws in a fair and effective manner by identifying, arresting, detaining, and removing aliens who are illegally present in the United States or otherwise violate our immigration laws. The enforcement of these laws is critical to the national security and public safety of our country. Despite the complexity and immense difficulties of this mission, the incredibly dedicated men and women of ERO execute their duties humanely and professionally, and I'm extremely proud to have the privilege of representing them here today. ERO plays a critical role in the identification, arrest, and removal of gang members who are in the country illegally. As the lead entity for the enforcement of the United States Code Title VIII dealing with aliens and nationality, we are able to target MS-13 and other gang members on the basis of their immigration violations, enabling these public safety threats to be removed from the communities they are victimizing and returned to their home countries. As a result of our expertise in leveraging both civil and criminal immigration law, ERO is an invaluable partner to international, federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies and our joint efforts to fight criminal gang activity. To illustrate, in fiscal year 2016, ICE removed 2,057 gang members and associates, and thus far in 2017, we have removed 2,798 gang members and associates. Through a variety of unique initiatives and task forces, ERO works closely with many other law enforcement agencies, and in particular, our partners in Homeland Security investigations. One such program on the international front is the Security Alliance for Fugitive Enforcement, or SAFE, which provides a platform for ERO to combat the issue of foreign criminals fleeing to the United States after committing violent crimes in their home countries. Operating under the direction of ERO assistant attachés in the 3 Northern Triangle countries, as well as Mexico, SAFE has proven to be a vital bilateral vehicle for law enforcement cooperation which directly impacts the public safety of the United States and its international partners. Through leads distributed by the SAFE program to ERO fugitive operations teams here in the United States, in fiscal year 2016, ERO facilitated the arrest and removal of 391 criminal fugitives and has built upon that success in this fiscal year with 413 SAFE arrests and removals, thereby returning these criminals to their home countries to face justice for their crimes. In addition to its essential law enforcement mission, ERO has a role in addressing the issue of unaccompanied alien children. Under the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, UAC who are nationals of non-contiguous countries are placed in removal proceedings. As you are aware, the vast majority of UAC encountered along the southwest border come from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. For children determined to be UAC, the TVPRA requires DHS to transfer them to the HHS Office of Refugee Resettlement within 72 hours. In FY16, DHS transferred over 57,000 UAC to ORR custody. In FY17 through June 3rd, we have transferred 29,537 UAC. For those UAC ordered removed by an immigration judge, ERO is responsible for the enforcement of the judge's order. In accordance with the TVPRA, ICE ensures that each UAC removal is fully coordinated with the foreign government authorities, including an opportunity for the UAC to communicate with the consular official prior to departure, repatriating the individuals at a designated port of entry, and ensuring that a government official or designee signs for custody. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you today and for your continued support for the men and women of ERO. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Albence. Now, Mr. Blanca.
Good morning, Chairman Grassley and members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here this morning on behalf of the Department of Justice to discuss the department's efforts to target, dismantle, and eliminate MS-13. Recent news reports are replete with examples of terrible acts of violence committed by MS-13, members who are intended to intimidate rivals, brutalize communities, and expand the gang's influence and control. The Department of Justice is bringing its full complement of law enforcement authorities to bear on this issue. The department's response takes several forms. One, investigating and prosecuting U.S.-based MS-13 members. Two, targeting international-based gang members for prosecution in their home countries. as well as in the United States. And 3, attacking cross-border criminal activity, such as smuggling networks, to prevent dangerous criminals from entering the United States in the first place. Given the complexities of these issues, the Department works collaboratively in coordination with its domestic and international law enforcement partners. Let me first turn to our domestic work targeting MS-13. Through task forces such as the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the FBI, Safe Streets and Gang Task Forces, Homeland Security Investigations, HSI task forces, such as Operation Community Shield, and those funded by the Organized Crime and Drug Enforcement Task Force program, the Department has successfully dismantled criminal organizations across the United States, including MS-13 cliques. The Criminal Division's Organized Crime and Gang Section, the United States Attorney's Offices, FBI, and HSI continue to work collaboratively, more than ever before, to investigate and prosecute MS-13 members. Recent prosecutions in the Northern District of Georgia, the District of Maryland, the District of New Jersey, the Department's commitment to bringing the justice to these communities and these acts of violence against MS-13 is obvious. In these districts, prosecutors secured the convictions of 22, 16, and 14 MS-13 members, respectively. Many defendants in those cases received life sentences, while others received sentences of decades in prison. And just last month, prosecutors in the Eastern District of Virginia secured the guilty plea of an MS-13 member who admitted his participation in a murder committed as part of a gang initiation. Our work, however, does not stop at the border. The FBI, HSI, and our Organized Crime and Gang Section lead investigations into foreign-based MS-13 leaders responsible for violence here in the United States. For example, the FBI's Transnational Anti-Gang Tag units, located in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, supply internationally generated information to many domestic MS-13 investigations. Indeed, in a series of MS-13 cases prosecuted in the District of Maryland between 2006 and 2010, the TAG unit in El Salvador received evidence seized in Maryland, which depicted incarcerated MS-13 gang members in El Salvador communicating with Maryland-based MS-13 members here in the United States. Based on that review, the TAG unit provided information to U.S. prosecutors to help identify defendants, locations, and relevant information to their investigations. The Department's in-country presence in the Northern Triangle not only generates intelligence useful in both domestic and foreign investigations, but it also allows the Department to fight MS-13 at its source. For example, with State Department funding, the Criminal Division's Office of Overseas Prosecutorial Development, Assistance, and Training deploys 5 Department of Justice prosecutors to serve as resident legal advisors in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, where they have mentored foreign counterparts in successful operations targeting MS-13's financial assets and leadership structure. In the last month alone, law enforcement in El Salvador, aided by Department of Justice prosecutors, made over 90 arrests and prosecutions of MS-13 and other gang members. Finally, we must stop those individuals who attempt to circumvent, exploit, or evade our immigration laws and border controls to bring dangerous gang members into the United States. Therefore, the Department, through its Human Rights and Special Prosecutions Section, works collaboratively with our interagency partners to facilitate investigations that target and attack smuggling networks that present national security threats. Thank you very much, and I appreciate and I will take any of your questions.
Thank you. We will have 5-minute rounds. I'm going to start with a separate question on the same subject for Ms. Provost, Mr. Lloyd, and Mr. Benner, and if he wants to join in, Mr. Elbens. One of the greatest concerns that I've had regarding the care and custody of unaccompanied minors is the fact that no one takes responsibility for these children after they're placed with a sponsor. Your agencies repeatedly pass the bucket to each other. As a result, children are allowed to disappear. When these children disappear without any real supervision, they're vulnerable to join dangerous gangs like MS-13. Some children are being abused in workshops under degrading conditions. Other children are being sexually abused by their sponsors. So, Ms. Provost, does your agency continue to maintain that it has no longer monitor or jurisdiction over unaccompanied minors once they're transferred to Office of Refugee Resettlement?
Thank you, Senator. So, Mr. Chairman, the key function, as I know you know, for CBP is we are the interdictors at the border, whether it's Office of Field Operations or Border Patrol agents. So our main focus on the immediate border and border security, once we apprehend unaccompanied children, and we've made huge improvements over the last few years in working with our partners at ICRO and at HHS ORR. So once we do identify someone as an unaccompanied child, as I said, we try to expedite, but definitely within 72 hours we do transfer them over to HHS, and at that point they become HHS's responsibility, and our focus goes back to our immediate border security function.
Yeah. So you've just said that at that point you don't have jurisdiction over them. Now, Mr. Benner and Albence, do you continue to maintain that you don't monitor or have jurisdiction over unaccompanied children until they obtain the finalized order of removal?
Yes, sir, that's correct. Under the TVPRA, the care and custody of the UACs falls under the responsibility of HHS. Once ICE ERO has made that transfer to HHS, we're largely removed from the process. Obviously, we follow the case as it goes through the immigration court, and then if and when a final order is issued by the immigration judge, then we would step in to effectuate that removal order. But during the pendency of those processes, we don't have the lawful authority to maintain custody or do anything with regard to that custody.
And probably, Mr. Benner, if you want to add to that.
Thank you, Senator. I would just add that HSI's point of inject in terms of the UACs and MS-13s is at the point they become involved in a criminal investigation that we're conducting. So several of these investigations can be long-term in nature, investigating the types of crimes that they're engaged in, typically trafficking, prostitution, and narcotics. But we work very closely with state and local partners when we do identify minors who may be even at risk of violence or of recruiting to have the maximum outreach that we can at that point without jeopardizing the criminal investigation.
And then, Mr. Lloyd, do you continue to maintain that except for the 30-day follow-up call after you place an unaccompanied minor with a sponsor, you don't have an obligation to monitor that person?
That's the historical position of ORR, but we're reviewing that closely. I wouldn't say that it's entirely clear, at least regarding category 2 and 3 sponsors, who would be those who are placed with close relatives or unrelated adults. With respect to category 1, I think there's a hard jurisdictional stop there where with the definition of unaccompanied alien child is one where the parents are not available or are missing. And so in that case, if we've handed off the child to the parents, then we view that as the end of our jurisdiction, and now it's in the hands of the parents. If that relationship starts to break down, then it's state child protective services that would step in at that point.
So I think we've heard it. There's a period of time, a whole period of time, when children are being monitored by no one. So legitimately and rhetorically raise the questions that we have to deal with. What is we going to do about it? Now, Mr. Lloyd suggested that they're reviewing something. Who should be monitoring these children up to the finalization of their immigration hearing? That's something that either Congress has to work on or the agencies have to work on, because there should be this proper follow-up. Senator Franken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Blanco, in my state of Minnesota, former Minneapolis Police Chief Tim Dolan used to say that crime victims are far less likely to dial 911 if they know that the police officer who responds to that call is going to check their papers. And the statistics bear this out. A 2013 study from the University of Illinois found that 44% of Latinos report that they are less likely to call the police even when they are the victim of a crime, because they believe that officers will use the interaction as an opportunity to check their immigration status. 45% say they're less likely to volunteer information about crimes they've witnessed. And this fear isn't even confined to immigrants. 28% of Latinos born in the United States say they are less likely to call the police when they're the victim of a crime because they fear police will ask them about their status or the status of people they know. Now, that study was conducted before the 2016 campaign, a campaign in which then candidate Trump made scapegoating immigrants the central pillar of his platform. I suspect that if the same study were conducted today after this administration has repeatedly condemned cities that limit their participation in federal immigration enforcement, that the study would find that even fewer Latinos are willing to call the police when they face danger. Mr. Blanco, you've worked in law enforcement for a long time. You've been a U.S. attorney and you've worked closely with other U.S. attorneys. Do you agree that in order to effectively fight MS-13 here in the United States, police need to have strong relationships with our immigrant communities?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, I've been in law enforcement for 28 years and have seen a lot of things and have worked in a lot of cities, Senator. I appreciate your question and I understand your concerns. I can tell you that it is really important for law enforcement to have the respect and the trust of the community, and the community to have respect and trust for law enforcement. But there are a whole host of reasons why people may not want to call the police, and much of it has to do with the fear that they have of the violent crime gangs, not so much of the police. But it is an interesting dilemma that they have when they call the police, because they have to give their names, and these victims then are outed to these MS-13 gang members and other gang members. And that really, in my 28 years, has really been the fear that they have of perhaps calling the police, not so much the other way around. They're really scared of these people. They're terrified, and many of them live in the same communities. So really the victims here are the people who the MS-13 gang members are targeting, and they are generally the immigrant community that it comes over. And that's really what they fear. At least that's what I've seen.
Well, this kind of confirms to some testimony I've heard from the Thomas Manger, who is police chief in Montgomery County, Maryland. He's had some experience dealing with MS-13. Here's how he described the gang's current tactics. Quote, before they extorted illegitimate businesses such as illegal liquor stores or brothels, but we have begun to see extortions of legitimate Latino businesses. Mr. Blanco, to me, the tactics that Chief Manger described show MS-13 adapting its strategy in order to capitalize on growing distrust that our immigrant communities have for law enforcement. The gang seems to be exploiting that anxiety. In your view, what can law enforcement do to counter that strategy?
I think, Senator, your suggestion of having that sort of unity with the law enforcement community and our immigrant community is going to be very important. Many of these immigrants don't understand how our law enforcement works, and they equate our law enforcement with perhaps the countries where they came from, which is very different. As you know, Senator, and I'm sure you agree with me, there is nothing better than American law enforcement. The integrity and the diligence with which they work is incredible. And I think that association with that immigrant community is going to be very, very important. One thing to note, though, Senator, is that they're not only going after illegitimate businesses, which, you know, is common amongst criminals. And as you mentioned, they're going after legitimate businesses of immigrant community individuals because they know one thing. And what they know, Senator, is back home, they have relatives and they have friends. and so do the MS-13 individuals, because that's where their structure emanates from. And that is a very powerful tool that they have.
My time is up. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Corner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing. And thanks to each of you for your service to our country. And I personally believe you could use some help from the policymakers. That's members of Congress, because frankly, I think your hands are being tied in ways that make our communities more dangerous, not through any fault of your own, but as a result of the wrong policies. For example, let's assume, Ms. Provost, that a 16-year-old resident of San Pedro Sula in Honduras, reputedly the most dangerous city and the most dangerous country in the world, at least at one time when I visited that with Senator Kaine from Virginia recently, comes across our southwestern border. Under current law, you can't hold that 16-year-old individual, more than 72 hours, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
If that person had come from Mexico, a contiguous country, the Border Patrol could turn that person back at the border. They could voluntarily return. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So it's as a result of the congressional policies that you are then required to turn that individual, that 16-year-old, over to Health and Human Services and the work that Mr. Lloyd and his colleagues do. So, Mr. Lloyd, I know you just got on the job in March, and so please don't take my questions as being antagonistic or critical of your conduct or those who have come in with the new administration. But as the chairman pointed out, that 16-year-old would then be placed with a sponsor here in the United States and be told to return at some future date for a court hearing to determine whether they could stay in the United States, whether they would qualify as a refugee or for some other legal status. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And under current law, that sponsor need not be a family member.
Right.
It need not be a citizen.
Right.
It could be an undocumented individual.
Yes.
And you have there's no legal requirement, nor do you have your organization have the current ability to monitor the situation of that unaccompanied minor in the custody of that sponsor more than a few days after they're placed. Is that right?
30 days after we do a check-in call with the sponsor and the UAC, and and in some cases we do have post-release services, but that's in limited cases if there's mental health concerns or special concern about the child, and a lot of that has to do with limitations and resources.
Do you know how many unaccompanied immigrant children there are with sponsors in the United States today?
Some have aged out of that category, but there's about, I'm going to guess, and I'd look for concurrence from my friends here, but about 200,000.
200,000 minor children who've in custody of sponsors. And Ms. Provost, if you suspect that this 16-year-old is a member of MS-13 or some other transnational criminal organization, do you have any authority to do anything other than to process them within 72 hours and turn them over to Health and Human Services?
No, sir, but we do, if we suspect that they find a gang affiliation, we do make notification to HHS.
Right. And Mr. Lloyd, I think the gap in our U.S. government's approach to these unaccompanied minors is pretty obvious. If you're placing them with sponsors that aren't even citizens, may not even be family members, you can't tell us how many of these children, nobody can really tell us how many of these children are being trafficked, become recruited as gang members, or anything of that nature, can you?
The best we can do at this point, and we've been doing everything that we can to tighten it up, but the best we can do is to scrutinize the sponsor who comes forward to sponsor the child, and also while the UAC is in care to monitor any of their behavior to figure out whether they may be prone to criminal activity.
And my last question is, and of the hundreds of thousands of unaccompanied minors with sponsors here in the United States, Each of them has been given a notice to appear at an immigration hearing at some time in the future.
Yes.
But no one really knows how many of them will actually show up for that hearing and how many of them will simply melt into the great American landscape. Is that accurate?
Correct. That's correct. Our staff is looking at ways to address that, which could include an increase in monitoring, but there are some other ways that have suggested that there are ways to improve appearances at immigration proceedings, and once we have a better indication of that, we'll share it with Congress, but the situation you've described is correct.
Well, I'll come back and say you could use some help from the policymakers, in my view. Thank you.
We welcome any help.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much. I was at another hearing, so I appreciate it. I thought I would just get some general reactions from all of you as you've talked about the scope of this issue, know in answer to questions from my colleagues, but in broad terms with all of your respective agencies, what you've seen with these, following up on Senator Cornyn, the 200,000 plus kids that are these unaccompanied alien children who could be recruited by gangs such as MS-13, as he has pointed out, have been trafficked as well. What trends have you seen? What the consequences are? The measures that we could take to prevent this from happening. I'll start with you, Ms. Provost.
As I stated early on, and I apologize you did not hear, but our numbers are very low when it comes to unaccompanied children that we identify, at least at apprehension. The number is somewhere around 160 since 2012 that Border Patrol in particular has identified. That being said, of course, policies, the laws that we have been discussing and the support effort there, I think, in our continued work in conjunction with our partners is key to success here, and working with the Northern Triangle countries.
And how do you share this data with state and local law enforcement that you do have? Do you share it with them? Or?
We share the information with ICE, ERO. We do work on task forces, gang task forces, state and local. So information that we have there, of course, we share with them, as well as many federal task forces that we work in conjunction to relay the information related to gang activity or gang apprehensions that we have.
Okay. And your number of how many, did you say?
Since 2012, we have identified approximately 160 juvenile gang members that we have apprehended.
But the number of that larger number was for unaccompanied children in
For
general.
Unaccompanied children, since 2012, we have apprehended approximately 250,000.
Okay, that's the number. Okay.
I apologize.
No, it's understandable. Like, Mr. Lloyd.
Senator, with respect to gang involvement, in response to some of the inquiries we received, we did a census of our staff secure and secure populations on June 9th, and what we were able to find was out of 138 in that population, approximately 35 had identified gang affiliation.
But my original question, I know I got off on this, was just what do you think the most effective thing to do, if you could do one thing to prevent this from happening, since it's a hearing?
I think right now, with respect to our program, it's to equip the kids who are in custody to have the tools they need when they leave custody to avoid gang activity and any sort of violence, and also if there's past criminal involvement, to give them steps to find a different path.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Benner?
Thank you. The two most critical things, and the most critical aspect for us is shutting down the illicit financial pathways. So we know that MS-13 makes their money through extortion primarily, and through other exploitation crimes. And our focus from the investigative standpoint is to shut down those illicit proceeds from being returned to El Salvador, where the command and control uses that money to operate the international and the global gang organization. So we're doing this several ways, and starting with working with Treasury in 2012, OFAC is they've designated MS-13 as a transnational criminal organization. That helps us. That's a powerful tool. That allows us to essentially identify and block.
But what could we do to help you more? So I know that that's a good development, but what?
So the second part is the pathways that exist within the countries from El Salvador to the United States, and we need to shut those down. We need to put more resources in terms of intelligence analysts in our overseas offices to work with the host country law enforcement, to work with the prosecutors from Department of Justice, and be able to share real-time information with our partners through the intelligence to intelligence connection.
Okay, Mr. Blanco, you're nodding your head, so I'm okay. I'll go to Mr. Albans last. The head nod was just a.
Thank you, Senator. A couple of things. One is, Mr. Benner is absolutely right. Going after the financial structure is really important. And that I think, as you pointed out earlier, is a good thing. But what can you do for us? I think what we need to do is be able to take the fight to them. And that fight would be working with our foreign counterparts in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and making sure that fight over there is a tough fight. And they're willing partners. So that is one thing I think that you can help us with. The other you can help us with is the resources to identify the bad actors here and remove those bad actors here from this country and send them back from which they came. I think that's another thing.
Okay, last, Mr.
And just real briefly, thanks.
Yes, following up on your statement there, I think as Chief Provost has mentioned, there has been a decrease in what we've seen of UACs entering the border, and I think some of that can be attributed to the more robust civil immigration enforcement that has been occurring as of late. We do know from intelligence reports back at the height of the UAC crisis that there was a pull factor from the thought being that there was lax immigration enforcement policies. We feel that the more robust enforcement and the fidelity to the Immigration Nationality Act and the way we're enforcing it is preventing a deterrent, so that there is no incentive for these individuals to come because they feel like they're going to be returned.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Kennedy, Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony. It was very interesting. I understand the legal definition of unaccompanied child, UAC, but what ages are we talking about typically? Are these older children or younger children or medium?
From what we apprehend at the border, the range is actually extremely wide, from a large group of maybe 12 to 17-year-olds, but we have very young children as well.
How does a young child get across the border illegally?
So this is where, when we look at trafficking in or coming with other individuals, that the family members, I think this comes to the point of certainly working with the Northern Triangle countries and the benefit that it would bring, because many of them arrive with.
Are they alone? Are they accompanied by an adult?
They are often accompanied. They are in groups that may have other adults in them, or often older children, though, still at times, that are maybe teenage.
All right. What role, if any, do sanctuary cities play in this problem, so-called sanctuary cities? Anybody? I can't see your names here, so.
I think one thing, you know, from the ERO perspective and the civil immigration enforcement, obviously these individuals are involved in criminal activity. Right? We identify, the largest program that we have within ERO is our criminal alien program, where we go into jails and identify individuals who've been arrested for a state or local criminal violation. That is where we identify the lion's share of the gang members that we come in contact with outside of the HSI investigations. Having access to those jails, having access to the information on those individuals that are in those jails allows us to take the proper enforcement action against those.
Let me interrupt you because I've only got 5 minutes. Do sanctuary cities contribute to this problem substantially or not?
They're certainly a factor.
Okay. So, do you consider them to be a major factor?
I think there's some major cities in this country where I can't even send my officers to go into the jail to interview somebody that's been arrested for a gang activity or is a known gang member, and we can't go in there and identify that person and take an enforcement action against them. Certainly that's a problem.
Even if the person arrested is a member of MS-13?
Correct.
So I want to be sure I understand. These are evil people. It's pretty hard to miss them. There are tattoos all over their body, and I'm sure most local law enforcement officials have a good idea of who these folks are. If they're arrested and they're in a local jail, there are some cities in the United States that would prevent you from coming in and talking to them, interviewing them, saying, hey, let's be sure they're a member of MS-13 and get them in jail?
Correct. In order for us to, in many cases, we know who these individuals are. We have biometric identifiers. They've been arrested by the Border Patrol, have been arrested by ICE previously and removed and never entered the country unlawfully. We know who they are. We know they're gang members. We know they're criminals. But if the county or the city does not allow us to get into the jail to make that final determination, to process that individual for removal and take custody of that person, then they're released back into the communities to re-victimize them.
And we're talking, these are known members of MS-13.
Absolutely.
Who killed people and raped people, children.
Yes, sir.
Which cities?
I mean, Chicago is a large one. We haven't been able to get into Cook County Jail for quite a long time. And obviously there's significant crime problems within the city of Chicago.
What other cities?
New York City.
What other cities?
There's a rather long list. There's some cities that don't give us full cooperation. So we may have.
Which ones don't give you full cooperation?
That's a fairly long list. I'd be glad to get to you afterwards.
Name a couple of them on there.
San Francisco. We can't get into that county.
New Orleans?
No, I think New Orleans we're able to get inside that jail, sir. I have to confirm that, but I think we are.
Now, but I want to be sure I understand if anybody on the panel disagrees with this, okay? Because I understand Senator Franken's point. If you're in the country illegally, you're less likely to call 911, and that's a valid point. And you're less likely to want to be a witness against somebody committing a crime. But that's not what we're talking about here. I want to be sure I understand this. If you just give me 30 more seconds, Mr. Chairman. We're talking about a member of MS-13. And for the most part, everybody in law enforcement, state and local, knows they're a member of MS-13. And they know what MS-13 does. And they've been caught, and they're in a local jail. And we have cities that refuse to let you come in and talk to them and prosecute them.
That's correct. We're not asking the state and local agency to do anything besides give us access and transfer that individual to our custody at the completion of their criminal process so we can have a safe, orderly transfer and then remove them from the country or prosecute them as accordingly.
Wow. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Albans, I think I share Senator Kennedy's wow. I think I'll be following up with a letter, too, for a lot more clarification on some of the details about the interaction with county and city and state jails. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to try and be quick, but quite honestly, if we get a second round, I'm going to ask a couple more questions. First off, I just want to reinforce what Senator Cornyn said. A lot of the things that you've just heard Senator Kennedy's comments, it's an absurd situation in terms of the safety. And here's the sad part about what we're talking about there. Now, if they're guilty of murder or rape, hopefully they'll be prosecuted and incarcerated. If they're guilty of crimes that are just below a threshold, they could get released back into the community. And the community that they're most likely to be most violent against are the illegally present communities in these cities. They're victimizing their own population. This is a crisis in these communities of a large majority of illegally present persons. There's also a very interesting number of statistics I tried to glue together. Senator Franken, I think he said that some 48% of the illegally present population was unlikely to report a crime if they themselves were illegally present. There are 200,000, I believe I heard someone else say that there are some 200,000 unaccompanied children who have been placed with sponsors. And if the staff briefing memo is correct, some 80% of them are with people who are illegally present themselves. So if you do the math, 200,000, 160,000, and 48,000 of them are among people who would be unlikely to report a crime because they themselves are illegally present. We've got a system right now where we put 80,000 children in homes that if MS-13 were recruiting them, they'd be unlikely to report criminal activity that would protect these 80,000 illegally present children. Now, y'all can't fix that. We've got to fix that. I want to go down the, and by the way, I learned as a freshman last year, this list is very helpful to get the names. It's a sort of freshman hazing. You don't get to read the nameplates when you're here.
I still can't see the names, which I think is probably an OSHA violation, Mr. Chairman.
Well, the seats are OSHA violation.
It's called a juniority violation, actually. I've been in that seat.
But, Ms. Provost, when we talk about help, how helpful would it be to break, to me, there are about 3 or 4 supply chains of what I consider to be criminal activity, and many of them resulting in death along the border. You have the plazas and the cartels right across the border. They have relationships with MS-13 and other TCOs. How helpful would it be for us to increase our operational awareness and security of the border? And I want to add to this something that you said. On the one hand, border crossings are down, but the threat to our border security agents are going up. Would it be logical to assume that it's because there's maybe a higher share of people who are crossing the border illegally now or doing it for illicit and potentially violent activities?
So certainly as we tighten down on border security, our experience over the years has been as we do a better job, unfortunately the violence against our men and women rises. As it becomes more difficult to cross the borders, So
the human smugglers are going to be better armed, probably more sophisticated, the ones who have been doing it for a longer period of time, maybe higher levels of coordination. So it puts you,
yes, sir.
It puts you in a much more dangerous situation.
Yes, it does.
So it would seem to me that, we have a debate here about border security. It would seem to me that to the extent that we put people, technology, and infrastructure on the border, we're not only addressing a national security problem, but we may also be addressing a humanitarian element in terms of limiting the amount of human smuggling that's occurring that ultimately get into drug or trafficking, human trafficking, prostitution, the other things that occur that create the currency that MS-13 uses to run their organization. Is that right?
Yes, those resources certainly support our efforts, and any kind of impact that we can have on these TCOs to disrupt or dismantle their operations is key to our success.
I've got a lot more questions. I only have 43 seconds, but Mr. Chair, if time allows, I'll probably will go to a second round. I did want to go to either Mr. Benner or Mr. Blanco. I know the Treasury added MS-13 I think in 2012 as a target for potential economic sanctions. Have they worked, and what more should we look at to disrupt their flow? That's one question. And Mr. Benner, I would like for you to get to equitable sharing. I think you and Mr. Blanco may have mentioned how coordination with state and local law enforcement is critically important. For those who don't know what equitable sharing is, that's where state and local law enforcement are able to benefit from some of the asset forfeiture to fund operations that go beyond what they would normally do when they're cooperating with federal authorities. How important do you think that program is?
Thank you, Senator. As far as equitable sharing, that's one of the most valuable tools that we have in federal law enforcement, is to support the resources that state and local communities actually dedicate to our task forces. Well, absolutely.
And just to be clear, we only have 30 seconds.
We rely on the state and local officers because they know the gang activity in their neighborhoods better than we do. And the ability for us to reimburse and support through our state and local overtime fund and through asset sharing is invaluable.
Senator Whitehouse.
Senator Cruz has asked me to yield my time, so I'm more than happy to do that.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Much appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to each of the witnesses for being here. MS-13's motto is to kill, rape, and control. And just a few months ago, this horrific fact was driven home in my hometown of Houston, where in March, MS-13 gang members were charged with kidnapping 3 teenagers and murdering one in an apparent satanic ritual, according to news reports. After the girls were kidnapped and before the murder, the 3 girls were forcibly held in an apartment and drugged and repeatedly sexually assaulted. I want to ask each of you, this is not an isolated instance, but rather part of a larger problem. And so from a federal perspective, how bad is the MS-13 situation in the state of Texas? How big a threat is it, and what more do we need to do to protect against MS-13? Mr. Blanco?
Senator, thank you for your question, and thank you so much for your leadership in this area. This is an important area for us. The threat is everywhere, not only in Texas. It's in every urban community, every rural community, everywhere in the United States. And that's why the Department of Justice, along with our colleagues at DHS and FBI and everyone else, are taking this very seriously. What you can do, Senator, I think we've talked a little bit about that today. You can help us take the fight to where it emanates from. Work with our overseas colleagues and make sure that those people never get here to the United States. And those people who are already here, so that we can either prosecute them here or send them back so they can be prosecuted in their own countries. I think we also need to take a look at the juvenile people now. Get them while they're young. Make sure that we have programs in place where we can let them understand how bad it is to be a member of the gang and the detriments of doing that as well, and so that people can be aware. Those are the two things, I think, Senator, that we can begin doing.
Now, is it accurate that many of the MS-13 gang members who've been arrested over the last decades have been illegal aliens, came to this country illegally, and indeed a significant number of them came as unaccompanied minors?
Senator, I don't have those specific statistics. Perhaps my colleagues do. But I can tell you this, it is a combination. You have MS-13 members who are U.S. citizens, but the command and control structure, as we understand it now, is in El Salvador. And you're seeing those individuals to come over here and lay down the law with their fellow MS-13 members and giving them instructions and guidance to be even more violent and to send even more money down to El Salvador to support the structure. So that's the answer to your question that I have.
Ms. Provost, in your written testimony, you stated CBP has faced many challenges in recent years, including large-scale flows of foreign nationals from Central America and Mexico. MS-13 took full advantage of these flows of foreign nationals into the United States by hiding in these populations to enter our country. As a result, American citizens have died. Would you elaborate on that testimony, please?
Well, certainly, and as I mentioned earlier with the numbers that we have coming through and specific to the state of Texas, across the border since 2012, we have apprehended approximately 5,000 individuals with gang affiliation of some sort, the majority of them being adults versus unaccompanied children, and approximately 3,000 of those have come through the state of Texas. But that makes sense with the amount of traffic that we've been having along the border, that being our highest traffic areas, as I know you know, Senator, are in Texas the last few years. So that is a concern for us. That is why we work very closely with our partners in ICE. We work on task forces with HSI and state and locals trying to address this issue, and it certainly is of great concern.
Mr. Alberts, have any known MS-13 members who were illegal aliens been released into the United States in recent years?
Yes. Once if they're UACs and come into our custody after the Border Patrol has made that apprehension, ICE has no authority to hold those individuals under the TVPRA. So by statute, we are required to turn those individuals over to ORR.
So is it accurate there have been reports that the Obama administration released at least 16 known MS-13 members into the U.S. after picking them up at the border? Are those reports accurate?
I've seen that intelligence report, yes, sir.
So that is accurate?
I believe it's accurate, yes.
Well, has the Trump administration released any known MS-13 members?
I couldn't answer that question. I don't have the information.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask you to answer that question. This committee wants to know. The answer needs to be no.
Well,
and if you are releasing known MS-13 members, it needs to stop.
Well, we don't release anybody any UACs. So anybody that's a UAC, we turn them directly over to the custody of HHS. So once they're in HHS custody, I can't speak to what happens to them.
So I'm asking you to follow up with this committee in writing with an answer to that question. And I would also ask you to follow up in answer to Senator Kennedy's question, I would like to know specifically what cities, what sanctuary cities or otherwise, have released known MS-13 members. That's highly troubling, and I suspect other members of this committee will be very interested in that information as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for your work. Let me ask a couple of questions of Mr. Blanco, if I may. Mr. Blanco, years ago when I was the United States Attorney in Rhode Island, we did a significant case against a Latin Kings group. And the way in which that group was operating was a little bit like a bunch of people who decided they were going to start selling hamburgers and called themselves McDonald's, i.e., this was local people who gave themselves the name Latin Kings, but they weren't very directly connected with what was then mostly a California and prison-based organization. And indeed, one of the ways we were able to make that case so effectively was by having a very brave undercover agent go in and pretend to be a real Latin king and get them to say what they were up to. So that has educated me to the difference between the actual network itself and others who, for purposes of intimidation or self-aggrandizement or whatever, model themselves and take the name of the organization. With respect to MS-13, how is that playing out? Or is it truly a very sort of corporate-style, centrally controlled organization, or like our Latin Kings group, is it kind of are loose franchises setting up that can operate independently?
I can tell you, thank you very much, Senator, for your question. It's a very important question. They are not loose. They are highly structured. And they're structured in a way that I think in modern times you would see how they adapt. There's a way to communicate. There are signals given to them. It's about money. It's about power. So there is a very
There's considerable command and control throughout the outfit?
Yes, sir.
And if somebody is running around declaring themselves to be part of the gang and isn't, what are the consequences for those individuals?
That's a serious problem for them, as they would say, un problema, and it would be taken care of pretty quickly.
Yeah.
It's a brand.
I think like many states, we have local police departments that have to deal with gang problems. Our police departments very much want the flexibility to be able to addressing these gang problems in the way that they need to as a law enforcement priority. And they have concern that unrelated immigration priorities might intrude. And if you need to give somebody's mother a pass because they're a cooperator with you, they want to make sure that they've got the flexibility to make sure that their law enforcement effort, which requires an enormous amount of community information to be effective, is not impaired. Is that a reasonable judgment on their part? And is that something that the Department of Justice wishes to support?
Senator, that certainly is a topic of a lot of conversation. As you know, you were the U.S. Attorney in Rhode Island, and in these kinds of investigations, there's a lot that goes into it. There's a lot of factors.
Yep.
And we do have ways and procedures that we work with our counterparts at DHS to accomplish exactly what you're talking about.
Because if you have a valuable cooperator or somebody who's perhaps even infiltrated themselves into the group and is the equivalent of a double agent almost.
That's right.
You don't want to necessarily grab their abuela and shut them out and have them say, okay, I'm done with you all.
You may not, but there are procedures in place, or you might, Senator, just to make sure that they're covered, right, so that nobody thinks that they're
But that should be the police department's job. The people who are running the investigation should be making those assessments, not somebody who doesn't even know about the investigation.
Along with the prosecutor, yes, that's correct.
Exactly, the prosecutor together.
Yeah. And there are procedures that we work with our DHS counterparts, whether it's paroling or giving them certain visas. So there is a process in place that takes care of that, at least federally.
Yeah, very good. Well, I appreciate all of your work on this problem. The ferocity of some of these gang organizations is horrifying.
It is.
And
it's getting worse, too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Durbin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lloyd, I'd like to ask you about a program called the Central American Minors Program.
Yes.
That was established under the previous administration in 2014 so that children from the Northern Triangle facing threats of extreme violence, often from MS-13 and other gangs, could go through security screenings in their own countries and safely rejoin their families living in the United States without making a dangerous solo journey. Approximately 11,000 children have applied in these 3 countries. Since the program started, 2,800 have been admitted. Can you tell me the status of that program today?
I would have to defer to my colleagues at the Department of State. That's where the program is housed. And apart from incidental contact with it and various information sharing, I wouldn't be able to give too much information on that.
I'm told this program has been stopped by President Trump's executive order that stopped all refugee processing before a federal court actually stayed the order. So I guess we all share a feeling, both sides of the table, MS-13 is reprehensible. Their exploitation and criminal activities on either side of the border should be stopped, and that we certainly want to protect their victims. In your capacity dealing with refugees, does it sound to you like a classic definition of a refugee to be a minor child who is facing threats of extreme violence or has been a victim of extreme violence from MS-13 in a country like the Northern Triangle?
Aside from, strict legal definitions, the category is very similar. That's why they're housed under the Office of Refugee Resettlement. They're similar population.
So the policy of the administration to halt this program to protect these children from MS-13's criminal activities doesn't seem consistent with the message that I'm hearing over and over in this hearing, that we care about the victims in the United States and other places, and we care enough, at least under this program instituted in 2014, to offer them refuge with their families in the United States. So there's a disconnect here between, quote, getting tough on immigration, getting tough on refugees, and really caring about what MS-13 is doing in these Northern Triangle countries. I don't ask you to respond to that because that's my own editorial comment on it, but it is troubling to me to deal with that. I wasn't here, Mr. Chairman, when there was a big discussion about the city of Chicago, and it's a shame because I'm proud to represent it. And I will tell you this, make no mistake, if MS-13 gang members are engaged in criminal activity, they're going to be prosecuted. We're not going to look the other way. When it comes to asking our state and local law enforcement to be immigration agents, they have the same reaction as a lot of other communities. Come on, Uncle Sam, where's the money? You want us to play immigration agent for the United States of America? Then come forward with the training and the resources to make it happen. I don't know what the discussion was before, but we're not looking the other way when it comes to criminal activity by these gangs or any other gangs. In fact, we've gone to the point of asking the new president, who has tweeted a lot about Chicago, please help us, send us some resources. We are stretched to the limit with what we're trying to do. And it's easy to be critical in these hearings, but when I talk to the men and women in law enforcement in Chicago and other places, they're looking for a helping hand and asking their senator, can you ask the president to help us? So far, we haven't seen it, and just the opposite's true with the Attorney General. He's basically stepped away from federal assistance to law enforcement agencies. So it's great to tweet your outrage at crime in Chicago. It's another thing to step up and join us in trying to stop it, and that invitation is still out there. Let me conclude as well. We have a broken immigration system. We have an immigration subcommittee of judiciary that should be exploring that. We haven't. This is the closest we've come. And I hope that we'll take up what is necessary to reform our immigration system and to improve it. We passed a bill several years ago, bipartisan bill, that wasn't even considered by the House of Representatives. I hope we'll try again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I share the very strong dedication that you are at the forefront of implementing by cracking down on these gangs, MS-13, Chi-18, because of their reprehensible activities and terrorizing people in communities, particularly Latino communities and elsewhere. And I think that the law enforcement strategy here has to be designed, as you know better than I, to elicit information from people who would come forward, as law enforcement always depends on participation by victims and survivors and others who know firsthand what the gangs are doing. So I was troubled to learn that in the recent anti-gang operation, Project New Dawn, which was a 6-week operation under Operation Community Shield, and produced 1,378 arrests. About 20% of those arrests, in fact, I think it's 280 individuals, had no criminal backgrounds or connections. My question first is to Mr. Albence. Why were so many immigrants who were not gang members and who had no criminal background arrested as part of this anti-gang operation?
I'll actually defer this to Mr. Benner. That was a Homeland Security Investigations run operation. So,
yeah. Thank you, Senator, for the question. So, of the 280, what we would term administrative arrests, the criminality of those and the criminal histories and the activity they were involved in may not have been presented for prosecution at that time. So, of the almost 1,100 criminal arrests, those are cases, Senator, where the arrestee was either facing a federal charge or a state charge, and they were being taken into custody to face those charges. The rest of there were a total of 280 in the administrative realm, very well could have some levels of criminality. We are still prioritizing our efforts in terms of the worst.
Well, when you say some criminality, they have criminal records? Were they committing a criminal act? Why were they arrested?
I'm sure there are many of those inclusive in that.
But you don't know for sure, as you, and I don't want to take time going through speculation. I'm not in any way questioning your good faith in responding, but I'd like to know why those 280 were arrested beyond just saying there may be some element of criminality.
So I can go take that back and do a deep dive into those 280 and be happy to brief you, Senator.
Thank you. The MS-13 gang, as I understand it, are not involved in actual narcotics trafficking. Is that correct? Mr.
Senator, it depends on what you mean by trafficking. They're not traffickers of narcotics as you would expect, Mexican and Colombian cartels and Guatemalan cartels, but they do distribute drugs, and they do make money off the distribution of drugs. And some of them, I'm sure, are trafficking in drugs, depending on the amount that you're talking about. Federally, when we talk about trafficking amounts, we mean a lot. So they could be traffickers in the sense of state, but they're involved in everything. Every criminal activity, as you know, it's a business for them. They're making money, so.
Are they involved in human trafficking?
Yes, they are involved in human trafficking.
Is that their principal activity, do you think, or their principal illicit activity?
I think it is one of their activities, but if you're talking about what I believe their principal activity is, probably more extortion, robbery, just threats against individuals here domestically that they then send the money back to El Salvador.
And are many of their victims undocumented immigrants?
I think some of their victims are undocumented aliens. Some of their victims are U.S. nationals who have family in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, because that sort of gives them the hook of getting these people as well and having them give over money or intimidate them by intimidating their family back home.
To make the point that I think perhaps Senator Franken raised, depending on cooperation from victims means that discouraging them may actually have a counterproductive effect. In other words, somebody who's undocumented, who's following the law, working hard, playing by the rules, as we often characterize them, may be discouraged from coming forward if they believe they're going to be deported or if they believe they're going to be arrested. So I'm wondering whether you have suggested or would suggest any changes in policy, this is a question that could be answered by any of you, that would enable you to be more effective in going against these gang members to elicit more cooperation from victims and survivors?
Senator, I'll take that question first. There are a whole host of reasons, Senator, and I think we talked about it a little bit earlier, of why victims don't want to come forward or witnesses don't want to come forward.
Fear being one of them.
Right. Well, it could be.
Maybe the predominant one.
I can tell you that I haven't seen that in my practice in 28 years federally. I have not seen it. I understand that there's some discussion about it. I can tell you one of the things that does concern them. One of the things that concerns them is when they live in the same community for which these people have been released back into the community. Mm-hmm. That worries them. And that prevents them from coming forward when you have places where people get to hide because law enforcement can't get them.
That's the fear of retaliation.
By the defendants, by those people who are committing crimes. That's one reason. There are a whole host of reasons.
Or by their friends and cohorts.
Could be. Could be.
So all the more reason that they need support from law enforcement. And I don't know what can be done. Obviously, the witness protection program can't be extended to thousands and thousands of people. It's not feasible. But I don't know what more can be done to encourage that cooperation.
Well, I can tell you hearings like this are important, and I can tell you that having communications with our DHS counterparts is really important. This is, as you can imagine, Senator, a lot of our discussion. But one of the things that I think is really important, I'll reiterate this, there is nothing like American law enforcement. There isn't anywhere in the world. Law enforcement individuals every day talk about how we can help victims and witnesses. So this is something that's always on our mind. And I think that is also translating into these communities as well.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm just going to ask a few questions and then we'll close out the hearing. Sorry. Mr. Blanco, I want to go back to something you said in response to Senator Blumenthal's question. Did you say in your 28 years of law enforcement you hadn't seen the factor of being illegally present as an inhibiting factor for any investigations you're doing? I'm sure that may have been a little bit of an over-exaggeration, but what you're saying is it's not the majority of the cases where people are concerned with cooperating with law enforcement?
There are, as I mentioned, there are a whole host of reasons. There could be reasons why they don't want to come forward because they're here illegally, and that could be some of the reasons. But as you mentioned earlier,
I think common sense would say that it is.
It is.
But again, I'm willing to go back and use the numbers that I saw here, where if Senator Franken in the survey that he quoted is correct, then that means that we've placed 80,000 children in households with illegally present people who are likely not to report criminal activity, up to and including recruiting of that unaccompanied child into MS-13.
Yeah.
If you believe the numbers, and I'm just using the numbers that were put forth before this panel. Mr. Albans, I need to understand. I've never been in law enforcement, and I'm not a lawyer, but I want to understand and maybe clarify something that Senator Durbin mentioned with respect to the sanctuary cities. And you happen to use Cook County, and I do want to echo the request from Senator Kennedy and modified by Senator Cruz. We need that information. But if you were allowed access to any sanctuary city, I'm not going to pick on anyone, what would happen if you were allowed access to people who were involved in gang violence? What happens next? Once you get access to that person, do they get transferred to federal custody?
Correct.
Okay, so if they get transferred to federal custody, I'm trying to understand how the request for more resources, when by definition you're moving them to a different jurisdiction, how that has anything to do with you having access to these sanctuary cities for people, particularly for criminal offenders.
Right. When we're referring to sanctuary cities, we're not requesting any law enforcement agency to do anything above and beyond what they're authorized.
What they're going to do anyway,
to authorize
based on the elements of the
We're asking for their cooperation to enable us to exercise our federal authorities to take enforcement action. So the individuals,
extent,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm just trying to be brief because many of you are going to get a request to meet with me in my office so that I can spend more than 5-minute increments to speak with you. But to what extent does that lack of access, let's not talk about the perpetrator that's in the jail, but to what extent does that lack of access hamper your broader investigations to go after the criminal enterprise? I mean, in some cases, maybe you can flip them. In other cases, you know, to what extent does that cut off a lot of trails that you would follow in your investigations?
Senator, as you point out quite eloquently, our investigations are based on information that we receive. Yeah. And if we're unable to receive information, then it hurts our investigations, both locally, domestically, and internationally. So it does affect.
Mr. Blanco, I did not get a chance to let you answer the question about sanction. It looks like you were going to say something to that effect. But what other devices do we need to apply pressure on the criminal enterprise? And it sounds like right now you're suggesting that some of the nations that have the highest percentage of people coming here and participating in MS-13 or any TCO that we're getting reasonably good cooperation. But what other things should we be talking about in terms of sanctions regimes that would be helpful to law enforcement?
With respect to sanctions regimes against the enterprise itself, I think the first step would be, you know, the OFAC designations. I don't know whether or not how valuable that has been, but I can tell you by seizing assets and taking their assets and using those assets either to pay back victims of crimes or reinvest it into law enforcement, that's a critical tool. And you may think that MS-13 doesn't have a lot of assets. They have cars. They have plenty of assets.
Sure they do.
Yeah, we're working on some programs that are targeting the OFAC using that tool in the financial realm to shut down that pathway. The remittances that are coming from the United States to El Salvador, generally they're small amounts, but it's almost like death by 1,000 pinpricks. I mean, if you got enough people earning money through extortion and prostitution, it adds up over time. And the command and control of MS-13 is different than many other street gangs. It's very solid, as Mr. Blanco said, very tight-knit, very command-centric. So that flow of money back to El Salvador is very important to them because they rely on it to further their operation. So this is an area that I'd like to brief you and other members on in a more private setting as to not tip our hand entirely in our tactics, but it's an area that we are laser focused on is cutting off the illicit proceeds between here and El Salvador.
I look forward to that discussion. Chief Provost, I should have mentioned in my opening comments, but I was mindful of time, that I spent 4 days down on the border, and I was very impressed with what I saw there. I think if we up here listen to what you all down there are saying, there's a way to secure the border. And there's a way to do it that will make your officers operate in a safer environment. And I think that we need to dispense with the we don't need borders, we need bridges discussion at one end of the spectrum and the other end of the spectrum that says that we need to build a structure that can be viewed from outer space. There is a happy medium that the experts on the ground there have said through people, technology, and infrastructure convince you that you can be made more safe. Do you think that that answer is somewhere in the happy median and not the extremes?
The border's very dynamic, sir, as I'm sure you have seen, and that mixture that you mentioned is we know this to be the right mixture, and it varies in different locations, but certainly that type of support for our frontline men and women would help reduce the risk to them and their security, help them do their jobs even better than they already do. So that resourcing is would be a huge support for us.
I bring that up in an MS-13 in the context of the discussion today because I think it's a vitally important way to disrupt their supply chains. It's a vitally important tool that also provides a better level of safety for border security, but it's a part of a multifaceted strategy to make it very difficult for these murderers and rapists and drug traffickers to be successful. Yes. And the last thing before I will have a closing statement that was offered by Senator Grassley, but you know, when we talk about the other thing that was remarkable when I was down there, because you hear people up here say one of the problems is you have the police and law enforcement entities in Mexico are corrupt, you can't work with them. A lot of people need to understand that there may be some corruption, but a lot of it has to do with life threats against those people and their families. In the same way that you have people entering MS-13 who but for their participation, may have their own lives or their family members back in their host countries at risk. I'm not excusing the fact that they may be entering into a criminal enterprise, but we have to understand how sophisticated and ruthless the leaders of these enterprises are, and we need to implement policies that let us, only figuratively speaking, cut their heads off. We have to do that, and then we have to implement policies that make it more likely that community policing techniques to where people in the communities feel safer working with law enforcement work. We have to implement policies that let you get into every jail in the United States and investigate more thoroughly the criminal enterprises that these TCOs represent. And we have to implement policies that are reasonable and respectful for illegally present children. That's how you start solving this problem. And I look forward to talking with all of y'all about that more, excuse me, in my office. Closing statement from Chairman Grassley. I want to thank all of you for being here and for your testimonies. As today's hearing has shown, MS-13 gang violence and unaccompanied children recruitment has become a serious problem. The brutal MS-13 gang has recently grown in size and strength, and the amount and scope of the crimes they commit are terrifying. At least 40 states have reported MS-13 gang activity and violence. Thousands of American communities are being affected by this organization and organizations like them. A big reason for this proliferation is our own federal government's negligence. The administration must do a much better job than the last administration. It needs to be careful not to hastily place unaccompanied minors from Central America, some of whom are gang members already, into American communities without proper screening or oversight. Steps must also be taken to prevent the flow of these minors and prosecute gang members to end the violence. This hearing has demonstrated that the current system is fraught with abuse, systemic errors, and a lack of effective cooperation between federal, state, and local agencies. I look forward to seeing each agency represented today to work together in the future to ensure these minors don't continue to fall through the cracks and become targets for gang recruitment or worse, victims of its brutality. That will conclude this hearing. The record will remain open for 1 week for member statements and questions from witnesses, or for witnesses. I know that I have a lot more questions, and many of you will have an opportunity to go into my office so that we can discuss this more fully. I thank you all for your service, and I look forward to your continued participation in solving this policy challenge. Thank you all. This meeting's adjourned.
Thank you for chairing, Mr. Tillis.
Oh yeah, what, you kidding me, man? I get a whole, I get
text them and see what they need.